Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study here at New Covenant House. We are, as you know, reading Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christianopoulos, who wrote it as his doctoral thesis. We are currently in chapter 3. Previously, we went through the Sermon on the Mount and some other writings from the four Gospels, and now we are looking at the relationship between the state and the church, and we are examining it from the perspective that we're reading from, looking at the actual events instead of from the scripture. So we're seeing how the events fit into the scripture instead. So the opposite of what we did before. So, and last week we began with Constantine making Christianity the official religion of Rome. And tonight we are looking at the period from Constantine up to Reformation. We're not really getting into the Reformation too much because that is a chapter by itself, almost is chapter 6 in this book, so we're going to be here for a while. But this is a period of time where the church really gains power in Rome. The Christian anarchists are looking at it from making 2 points here. One is that the history since Constantine, both the repressive reign of a perverted version of a Christianity, and the other point is that some examples of resistance by radical thinkers and sects. First is the Middle Ages, started from Constantine up to the Reformation, which is about 1,000 years or so. It's some people also refer it to the Dark Ages, and it really was extremely dark period of time in church history. The writer who is most prolific in this space is Andrews. We met him before several times. He wrote a book called Plan B about the Beatitudes. We went through that before. So in this time, the focus goes from the state controlling the church. So Constantine basically changed the church into the image of the state, and the state was in control. Now the power dynamic changes, so that now the church has control over the state. Andrew says slowly but surely took control of the state. And canon law, which is church law, now expands into the state. We can see how during this period of time the church is the driving force behind European colonization. And that is actually what late in this period of time we have a book named An Unsettling Truth by, I think, Mark Charles, who was a presidential candidate in 2020. And in there he mentions the concept of Doctrine of Discovery. It was an edict from the Pope that when you as a European discoverer went into a foreign country and you could conquer it, you were allowed to do that. And that's exactly what Columbus did in North America, and also South America, Africa. Other people did it in Africa and Asia. So that was completely a church decision that this was now allowed. So the church extended its geographical sphere of influence to much of the world at that time. The state was an instrument in the hands of the fallen church. Yeah, so like we just mentioned, that before Constantine had made the church an instrument in the state. Now it's the other way around. The church uses the state to enforce its dark laws. And some examples of that is the Crusades. The purpose was to conquer the Muslim expansion in that area. But it was politics wrapped in religion, basically. And another dark example is the Inquisition, where the church uses the state power to commit all these atrocities in the world. For Christian anarchists, therefore, medieval Christianity was false, violent, and vindictive. So that is the perverted version of Christianity that the anarchists are talking about. The more this few bright spots come around the Reformation, and actually comes a little bit before that. We have already met Piotr Chelcicki, who wrote in the 15th century. I've been saying that he was in the 13th century, but he's not. He's in the 15th century. But the point is that he is one of the writers who tries to stand up to this actually completely perverted church. But the writers say even these Christian dissenters did tend to increasingly give in to violence, even sometimes to compromise with the state. So that is actually something we experience here at the New Covenant House as well, where we are subject to the rule of the state. We have zoning laws that we have to comply with. We have tax laws and all kinds of things that we need to adhere to. So if we want to operate the way we want, so we have to compromise so that it fits into the world view that they have. So the Christian anarchists say that when they do that, they compromise. They're losing, from the Christian anarchist perspective, the Christian credentials with which they have begun. And then comes the Reformation and modernity and the Enlightenment. But we're not going to be talking about that here, because that will come in chapter 6, which is more about what we do when the kingdom comes. So, in other words, all this stuff that's going on in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages is completely incompatible with Jesus' radical political teachings, is what Andrews says. He also mentions that the church was anti-Semitic. There was a source of the anti-Semitism that fed the Jewish Holocaust, but there was also atrocities like that going on in Latin America. The church is guilty of disregard for human rights, and has a far from innocent hand in the worst cases of genocide in the 20th century, says Andrews. Something I wanted to mention is that also in the Dark Ages, we have some examples that I know of. For example, in around year 1000, King Harold, Bluetooth, had united Denmark and Norway, a considerable power in that area. At the same time, Karl the Great had united all these little principalities in Europe. He is Emperor Karl the Great, but he didn't do it on his military prowess. He did it on the back of the church. He was supported by the church, and Harold was a smart man. He knew that with this increasing threat, he could not defeat Karl militarily, but so what he did is he joined the church. He had originally planned a grand funeral for himself in a mausoleum, or it was like a memorial, a large. Some stones were set up in the shape of a large ship where he was going to be buried inside. But he abandoned that. He knocked all the stones over and built a church, and 2 mounds, one for his father and one for his mother. And then he declared Denmark and Norway to be Christian, just like Constantine had done 500 years before that. 600 years, actually. Another example here is when Harold's descendants, a couple of hundred years later, were conquering in Estonia. Their battle wasn't going well, so they prayed, and a flag flew down from heaven, and they won the war. The legend says that this is how we got the Danish flag. And the interesting part of it is that it has a cross, a white cross on a red background. And as a matter of fact, all Nordic countries except Greenland have that cross in their flags. And this is the same thing that Constantine did. He put crosses on all the standards in the Roman army. And if you look at the Crusades, King Richard the Lionhearted, you always see him as with his armor on and with a shirt with a cross on it. So the symbol becomes, the cross becomes a symbol of something that it really, really wasn't. It's a total blasphemy. But anyway, just some illustrations about how bad things got. Andrews says, puts it in an interesting way, the history of Christianity is as much a litany of cruelty as it is a legacy of charity. So all these atrocities with the Crusades and the Inquisition on one side, and then they were still able to spin it as to leave a legacy of charity. I mean, all the bad things, somehow they made it look good. They were doing it for good. To the victims of the violence committed in the name of Christianity, Andrews warns Christianity is the Antichrist, so it's exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to be. So for us, it's a matter of distinguishing the wheat from the chaff, the true acts of authentic Christian witness, and we have to separate that from violence, disloyally committed, supported, or implicitly tolerated by the church since Constantine. So this chapter is exposing the state violence and the church justified it as support for and participated in it. So that is the end of church history for us here in this study. Next week we're going to start a new sub-chapter in here. It's about the modern state and the economy, and there are 5 points they're going to make. First, they're going to define the state and the state violence, and then state deception, and then state exploitation, economic exploitation, and finally the state as idolatry. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next week.